Hey everyone, so this is just going to be a brief, unscripted video about everyone's favorite company, Nintendo. Now, the release of the Switch 2 will soon be upon us, and it's come with no small amount of controversy about things such as the system's price, the price of games, and this led me to think about this one particular narrative that's always sort of hung around Nintendo, which is that they, as a company, hate their fans. What do I mean by this? Well, Nintendo is notoriously strict with its intellectual properties. It doesn't like fan games, it doesn't like fan films, it doesn't like people just playing around with their stuff in general, and they are adamant that when you play a Nintendo game, you play it on their hardware and nowhere else. Not on PC, not on a Steam Deck, not on a phone, and certainly not an emulator. But why is this? Why is Nintendo like this? Well, I have a few theories, and I have to emphasize theories because this video is going to be largely speculation. Second, this is going to be more about explaining why Nintendo does what it does and not about defending them, because guess what? Large corporations don't need people defending them. They have lawyers for that, and lots of money. Now, Nintendo is a very old company. In fact, in Japanese, they are what's known as a shinise, or old shop, a company that's, well, more than 100 years old, and which tends to have a very conservative outlook on things. They tend towards steady growth instead of risky endeavors, and they generally like to build up cash reserves and avoid debt. In other words, it's basically the opposite of the startup, move fast and break things mentality. And that probably colors Nintendo's outlook on things a bit. I'm sure someone who knows more about Japanese corporate culture could explain it further. Also, Nintendo rose to power in the United States in part because of the collapse of Atari, and one of the reasons that Atari collapsed was that the market just got flooded with low-quality games, causing a loss of consumer confidence. So with the NES, Nintendo put in strict controls over third-party developers. They could only release 5 games per year, and they had to obtain a license from Nintendo before their games would even work with the console because they implemented a lockout system. But that's just one of the reasons why Nintendo is so protective of its IPs, and that is parental trust. Nintendo is often compared with Disney, another company that is notoriously litigious. If you put a circle with 2 smaller circles on it somewhere within your business, well, you might just be getting a letter from Disney's lawyers. And just like Nintendo, Disney likes to focus on family-friendly fare. And this is where that protectiveness comes from. It's kind of hard for childless people like me to appreciate this, but a lot of parents are very concerned about what their children watch, and Disney assures them that when they go take their children to see a Disney movie or a Disney TV show or some other Disney product, that they are going to see something that is wholesome and will not have anything too disturbing or too violent. That means that Disney must control how their characters and how their intellectual properties are depicted at all times, because their nightmare scenario is if some kid goes onto the internet and stumbles across Disney characters in some decidedly adult situations, and then their parents see it and they get all in a huff saying, "What is Disney doing making this filth?" Not realizing that there is a difference between, well, someone's fan art and official Disney art. And it's the same with Nintendo. In the 80s and 90s, children were being raised by parents who had not grown up with video games, and they generally tended to view them with some degree of suspicion, or a lot of suspicion in some cases. They were this new, unfamiliar form of entertainment, and there was a general anxiety about how they were affecting kids, especially with violent video games. There were so many moral panics about violent games like Doom and Mortal Kombat. In short, video games were often viewed as the brain rot of the day, which meant that parents were very concerned about what kinds of games their children were playing, and Nintendo, like Disney, offered a sort of promise to parents that when you buy a Nintendo game for little Timmy or little Bobby, they are not going to see anything too violent or too disturbing. And again, Nintendo's nightmare scenario, the one thing that probably keeps them up at night, is the idea that little Timmy could go onto the internet and stumble across something like Bowsette, or Nintendo characters in a Rule 34 situation, or some sort of fan game or ROM hack that presents Nintendo characters in a super violent or gory situation. And then the parents see this and freak out and go, "Oh my god, what is this filth that Nintendo is subjecting our children to? I thought they were a family-friendly company." And sure, you might think, well, there's obviously a difference between a ROM hack or some explicit piece of fan art, but parents might not know the difference. And that's really what Nintendo wants to do. They want to Karen-proof their operation. They don't want PR nightmares, they don't want controversy, they want parental trust. For Nintendo, fan games aren't a love letter, they're a liability, because who knows how some internet rando is going to depict Mario or Link or whoever. They don't want fan films because, again, they can't control how their properties are depicted. This is likely why Sega is a bit more permissive when it comes to fan-created content, because Sega never cultivated this family-friendly image. It's why Bethesda doesn't really care too much about pornographic Skyrim mods, because the Elder Scrolls games aren't for children. They do not attempt to portray anything close to a family-friendly world. And lastly, the reason Nintendo is so protective of their IPs is that they are incredibly valuable. Mario is one of the most recognizable video game characters in the world. Franchises like Pokemon pull in huge amounts of money. And unlike Sony or Microsoft, Nintendo's video game business is their entire business. They don't have another sector they can fall back on. If their games no longer earn them money, then they're finished as a corporation. And that brings me to my final point, which is that Nintendo doesn't hate their fans, because corporations cannot feel love or hate. They can only feel fear. Fear of having bad PR, fear of losing money. Those are the only things that can motivate them. Which means that Nintendo is never going to change their ways unless there is a strong financial incentive to do so. They will always be against emulation because, in their minds, the cost of letting players experience their games in an environment out of their control is greater than whatever it costs to send a cease and desist letter to someone. They'll never be in favor of fan games because, again, why would they? They're Nintendo. Their games have worldwide recognition. They sell millions of copies. They don't need people to make fan-created content for them. It's not like the Elder Scrolls, where having a strong modding community is a big selling point for the games. And yeah, that can really suck because I'd love it if I could buy Nintendo games on Steam. It would be so much more convenient if I could play them without having to actually use a Nintendo console. But hey, if people can buy games on Steam, then people can modify games in which Nintendo might not approve of. So yeah, you gotta play a Nintendo game on the Nintendo console. Don't like it? Well, too bad. People are just going to buy the console in huge quantities anyway, so your opinion really doesn't matter. That sucks, but hey, that's capitalism for you. Anyway, that's about all I have to say on that matter. And if you couldn't tell from the footage, I am putting the finishing touches on a video about Super Mario Sunshine, a game that's actually kind of terrible, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. See you later, everyone.